$5 for the black girl! The auctioneer's voice cracked across the dusty town square as the trembling 19-year-old stood on the wooden block, certain this was her end, until the giant cowboy's boots hit the ground with purpose. The crowd saw worthless property, something to be discarded or traded like livestock. They expected her to disappear into servitude, forgotten by morning. But the weathered rancher stepping through the jeering masses carried secrets that could reshape everything, a past that made him recognize what others couldn't see, and a guilt that demanded he act where he'd once failed. What none of them knew was that behind the girl's downcast eyes lay a mind sharper than any blade, and in the cowboy's saddlebags rested a badge that could turn their small corruption into a federal crime. Would his intervention save her, or would speaking up destroy the new life he'd built in hiding? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The candle flickered in Sybil's cramped quarters as she pressed the pencil stub against another scrap of newspaper. 3 years of Harold Tibbs' cruelty had taught her to move silently, to think quickly, and to remember everything. She documented his late-night visitors, the hushed conversations about land deeds, the envelopes thick with cash that disappeared into his coat pockets. At 19, she had survived by becoming invisible, but invisibility came with a price. The morning sun barely crested the horizon when Tibbs' heavy boots thundered up the stairs. Sybil quickly stuffed her makeshift journal beneath a loose floorboard and smoothed her worn dress. The door burst open without ceremony. "Get up!" Tibbs snarled. His bloodshot eyes and rumpled clothes told the story of another night at Ruth Thorne's saloon. "We're going to town." Sybil had learned not to ask questions. Questions brought the back of his hand. She followed him to the wagon, her bare feet finding purchase on the splintered wood. The ride into Cedar Falls passed in tense silence, broken only by Tibbs' muttered curses about debts and deadlines. The town square buzzed with morning activity. Merchants hawked their wares while children chased chickens between the stalls. But something felt different today. A crowd gathered near the auction platform typically reserved for livestock and farm equipment. Tib grabbed Sybil's arm and dragged her toward the platform. Her stomach dropped as understanding dawned. The auctioneer stood ready, his voice already warming up the crowd. "No," she whispered. Tib's grip tightened. "Should have thought about that before your parents died owing me money." The platform felt like a cliff's edge. Below, faces stared up with casual interest, as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture to be appraised. Some laughed. Others placed small wagers on the outcome. "What am I bid for this girl's labor contract?" the auctioneer called out. "Strong back, knows her place, won't give you trouble." Silence stretched across the square. Sybil closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's voice, her father's gentle hands teaching her letters in 3 different languages. The education they had sacrificed everything to give her felt meaningless now. $5, someone finally called from the back. The crowd erupted in laughter. $5, the price of a decent meal or a bottle of whiskey, her entire future reduced to pocket change. "Come now, surely someone can do better than 5, the auctioneer cajoled. More silence. Sybil opened her eyes and saw the bidder pushing through the crowd, a rough man with yellowed teeth and hands that lingered too long when they looked at her. Her skin crawled as he approached the platform. "5 it is, then," the auctioneer announced, raising his gavel. "50. The voice cut through the square like a blade. Every head turned toward the back of the crowd where a tall figure sat astride a black horse. The cowboy's hat cast shadows across his weathered face, but his eyes burned with something Sybil couldn't name. The crowd murmured in confusion. $50 could buy a decent horse or several head of cattle. No labor contract was worth that much, especially not for someone like her. Jacob Hawk dismounted slowly, each movement deliberate. He had watched enough auctions in his 32 years, but none had ever made his chest tighten like this. The girl on the platform reminded him of another face, another person he had failed to protect when it mattered most. "Did you say 50?" the auctioneer stammered. Jacob nodded and approached the platform. He pulled a leather pouch from his coat and counted out the coins with practiced efficiency. The crowd pressed closer, eager to understand this strange transaction. Tib snatched the money before the auctioneer could finish his spiel. "Sold," he declared, not waiting for ceremony. Jacob climbed onto the platform and extended his hand to Sybil. She hesitated, searching his face for some hint of his intentions. His eyes held none of the cruelty she had learned to expect from men. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. The question caught her off guard. Nobody had asked her name in 3 years. "Sybil," she whispered. "Sybil," he repeated, as if testing the weight of it. "Do you speak any languages besides English?" The question was so unexpected that she answered without thinking. "Sí, hablo español. Je parle français aussi." A ripple of surprise ran through the nearby crowd. Many had known her since childhood, but had never heard her speak anything but English. Some had assumed she was too simple to know much of anything. Jacob's expression shifted. The defeated girl he had expected to rescue was revealing layers he hadn't anticipated. "Can you read?" he asked. Sybil glanced nervously at Tib, who was counting his money with obvious satisfaction. Reading was not something girls like her were supposed to know. "Yes," she said finally. Jacob helped her down from the platform. As they walked toward his horse, he noticed how she carried herself despite everything. There was intelligence in her eyes that spoke of hidden depths. Ruth Thorne watched the exchange from her saloon doorway. She had seen many transactions in Cedar Falls, but this one felt different. The cowboy's questions revealed purposes beyond simple labor acquisition. As Jacob lifted Sybil onto his horse, she caught sight of something in his saddlebags. The edge of a metal badge glinted in the morning sun before he quickly adjusted the leather flap to hide it. Tib pocketed the last of the coins and headed straight for the saloon. His gambling debts were settled, but something nagged at him about the cowboy's easy payment and strange questions. Jacob mounted behind Sybil and guided the horse toward the edge of town. She had expected this day to mark the end of everything. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something she couldn't yet understand. Behind them, the crowd dispersed, already moving on to other entertainments. None of them suspected that the transaction they had just witnessed would transform Cedar Falls forever. The ride to Jacob's ranch passed in careful silence. Sybil gripped the saddle horn as the horse navigated the winding trail through pine-covered hills. She had expected immediate orders, demands, or worse. Instead, Jacob spoke only to warn her of low branches or rough terrain. His ranch appeared modest from a distance. A single-story cabin, weathered barn, and scattered outbuildings spoke of a man living simply. But as they drew closer, Sybil noticed details that contradicted first impressions. The fencing was expertly crafted. The barn doors hung perfectly straight. Everything showed the touch of someone who understood quality work. Jacob helped her down from the horse with the same careful respect he had shown in town. His hands never lingered or presumed familiarity. The gesture confused her more than harsh treatment would have. "Are you hungry?" he asked. The simple question nearly broke her composure. When had anyone last asked what she needed? "Yes, sir," she whispered. He led her to the cabin and gestured toward a sturdy chair at a wooden table. The interior was sparse but clean. Books lined one wall, more than she had ever seen in a single home. The sight made her heart race with unexpected possibility. Jacob moved efficiently around the small kitchen, preparing coffee and slicing bread. His movements held the precision of someone accustomed to taking care of himself. No servants or hired help had carved out this life. "You mentioned speaking Spanish and French," he said, setting a plate before her. "Where did you learn?" Sybil hesitated. Sharing personal history felt dangerous after years of hiding everything that mattered. "My parents," she said finally, "before they died." "What were their names?" "Maria and Thomas Reyes. She was from Mexico. He was educated in New Orleans before the war." Jacob nodded as if the information held weight. Most people dismissed her parentage as irrelevant or worse. "They taught you to read in all 3 languages?" "Yes, sir. And numbers. Papa said education was the one thing nobody could steal." The irony of those words hung between them. Everything had been stolen except what lived in her mind. Jacob poured coffee into 2 cups and sat across from her. The gesture of equality startled her. Masters didn't share meals with property. "I need to be honest with you about something," he said. "I didn't buy your contract to put you to work." Sybil's hand froze halfway to the coffee cup. If not work, then what? Her mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. "I saw what was happening in that square," Jacob continued. "What Tib was doing. It wasn't right. Nothing about my life has been right for 3 years." The bitterness in her voice surprised them both. She had never spoken her truth so plainly. Jacob studied her face with new attention. "What do you mean?" Sybil weighed the risks of honesty against 3 years of careful silence. Something in his manner suggested she might finally have found someone who would listen. "Tib has been cheating people," she said. "Families like mine. People who can't fight back." "How do you know this?" Sybil's pulse quickened. She was about to reveal her most dangerous secret to a man she had known for 2 hours. "I documented everything," she said quietly. "Every meeting, every transaction, every family he destroyed." Jacob leaned forward. "Documented how?" "I kept a journal, hidden under my floorboard." 3 years of evidence. The words transformed Jacob's expression completely. He stood and began pacing the small cabin with renewed energy. "Do you understand what you're telling me?" he asked. "That I've been foolish to keep such dangerous records? That you might have evidence of federal crimes?" Sybil stared at him. "Federal crimes?" Jacob stopped pacing and faced her directly. The moment had come to reveal his own secret. "I used to wear a badge," he said. "U.S. Marshal. I know fraud when I hear it described." The cabin fell silent except for the crackling fire. Sybil processed this revelation alongside everything else that had happened since morning. "Used to?" she asked. Pain flickered across Jacob's features. "I failed to protect someone important. Lost my family in a fire 3 years ago. Left the badge behind because I couldn't trust myself to do the job anymore. But you saved me today. Maybe, or maybe I'm just trying to make up for past failures." Sybil stood and walked to the bookshelf. Her fingers traced the leather spines with reverence. Law books mixed with literature and technical manuals on ranching. "These are yours?" she asked. "Reading helps fill the quiet hours." She pulled a volume of legal statutes from the shelf and opened it to a random page. Her eyes moved quickly across the text, absorbing concepts and terminology. "Land fraud involving federal postal services," she read aloud. "That's what Tib has been doing, using fake documents sent through the mail to steal property." Jacob moved to look over her shoulder. "You understand legal language?" "I understand injustice." "The language follows naturally." She closed the book and turned to face him. For the first time in years, she felt the stirring of hope mixed with purpose. "My journal contains names, dates, property descriptions, and witness accounts," she said. "Everything you would need to build a case." "Everything we would need," Jacob corrected. The distinction mattered more than either of them had words to express. "There's something else," Sybil said. "Ruth Thorne at the saloon. She watches Tib's meetings but never participates. Always stays just close enough to hear but far enough to seem uninvolved." Jacob nodded slowly. "Interesting observation. You think she might help us?" "I think," Jacob said, "that we need to retrieve your journal before Tib realizes what he's lost." Sybil smiled for the first time in 3 years. The expression felt foreign on her face, but remarkably natural. "When do we leave?" she asked. Darkness crept across Cedar Falls as Jacob and Sybil approached Tib's house on foot. The gambling money had kept him at Ruth's saloon longer than usual, giving them the window they needed. Sybil's hands trembled as she led Jacob around to the servants' entrance. The house felt different now. What had been her prison for 3 years now seemed smaller, shabbier. Jacob's presence beside her transformed everything into something she could face and overcome. Her quarters occupied a cramped space beneath the main staircase. She dropped to her knees and pried up the loose floorboard with practiced efficiency. The leather-wrapped journal emerged from its hiding place like buried treasure. Jacob held the lamp while she unwrapped the precious bundle. 3 years of meticulous documentation lay before them. Names, dates, property descriptions, and witness accounts filled every page in her careful handwriting. "This is extraordinary work," Jacob said, scanning the entries. "You've recorded enough evidence to prosecute a dozen men." Sybil felt pride swell in her chest for the first time in years. Her secret project had been more than therapeutic. It had been preparation for this moment. A sound from the front of the house froze them both. Heavy footsteps crossed the wooden porch. Tib had returned early. Jacob grabbed Sybil's hand and guided her toward the back door. They slipped into the night just as Tib's key turned in the front lock. The journal pressed against Sybil's chest like a shield made of truth and possibility. They made their way through the sleeping town toward Ruth's saloon. Light still spilled from the windows, and the sound of piano music drifted into the street. But something felt wrong about the scene. "Wait," Jacob said, pulling Sybil into the shadows between buildings. Ruth Thorne stood on her saloon's back steps, speaking quietly with a man in a dark coat. The conversation looked too intentional for casual business. Money changed hands, but not in the obvious way of normal transactions. "She's involved," Sybil whispered. "Maybe, or maybe she's something else entirely." The man in the dark coat disappeared into the night. Ruth remained on the steps, scanning the street with practiced awareness. Her gaze settled on their hiding spot with uncomfortable accuracy. "Jacob Hawke," she called softly. "Bring the girl. We need to talk." Jacob's hand moved instinctively toward his hip, where a gun would normally rest. Old habits from his martial days demanded caution, but something in Ruth's tone suggested opportunity rather than threat. They emerged from the shadows and approached the saloon. Ruth's expression held none of the dismissive cruelty Sybil had learned to expect from adults in Cedar Falls. "You've been busy tonight," Ruth said. "How do you know?" Jacob asked. "Because Tib is upstairs tearing his house apart looking for something. And because you two are the only people in this town brave enough or foolish enough to cross him." Ruth opened the saloon's back door and gestured them inside. The main room was empty except for a few die-hard gamblers too drunk to notice newcomers. She led them to a private room behind the bar and closed the door firmly. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the walls as she poured 3 glasses of whiskey. "I've been waiting 3 years for someone like you to show up," she said to Jacob. "Someone like me? Someone with the authority and backbone to do something about what's happening in this town?" Jacob frowned. "What do you know about authority?" Ruth reached into her dress pocket and produced a small leather folder. The badge inside caught the lamplight and threw it back in sharp reflections. "Pinkerton Detective Agency," she said. "I've been investigating land fraud in this territory for 8 months." The revelation hit Jacob like a physical blow. Sybil's mouth fell open as understanding dawned. "You've been working undercover," Jacob said. "The agency received complaints from families who lost property through suspicious transactions. All roads led back to Cedar Falls and Harold Tib." Ruth sipped her whiskey and studied them both with professional interest. "I've been building a case, but I needed local evidence and trustworthy witnesses," she continued. "When I saw what happened in the square today, I knew my patience was about to pay off." Sybil clutched her journal tighter. "How long have you known about this? About the fraud? Months. About your documentation? I suspected but couldn't prove it until tonight." Jacob leaned back in his chair, reassessing everything he thought he knew about their situation. "Why didn't you approach us sooner?" he asked. "Because I needed you to come to me. A Pinkerton detective approaching a former U.S. Marshal and a witness with documented evidence looks like a setup, but a saloon owner helping concerned citizens looks like community cooperation." The logic was sound, but Jacob remained skeptical. "How do we know you're legitimate?" Ruth smiled and produced a telegram from her pocket. The official Pinkerton letterhead was unmistakable, as was the federal authorization for her investigation. "Because tomorrow morning, federal marshals arrive in Cedar Falls to make arrests," she said, "with or without your cooperation. But with your evidence and testimony, we can shut down the entire network instead of just grabbing Tib." Sybil opened her journal and spread several pages across the table. Ruth's eyes widened as she absorbed the scope of the documentation. "This is incredible work," Ruth said. "You've identified patterns I missed and connected transactions I couldn't prove." "How many families were cheated?" Sybil asked. "At least 20 that we know of. Probably more." The number hit Sybil like a physical weight. 20 families destroyed while she documented crimes in silence. "We can make this right," Jacob said, reading her expression. "All of it?" Sybil asked. "All of it," Ruth confirmed. "But we need to move fast. Tib knows something is wrong, and corrupt men make dangerous decisions when cornered." Jacob stood and extended his hand to Sybil. "Are you ready to finish what you started?" She looked at the journal, at Ruth's badge, at Jacob's determined face. 3 years of careful observation and documentation had led to this moment. "I've been ready for 3 years," she said. Ruth extinguished the lamps and led them toward the back door. Dawn was still hours away, but their real work was just beginning. Dawn broke over Cedar Falls with federal marshals riding into town. Ruth had arranged their arrival to coincide with the morning when most of Tib's associates would be available. The coordination impressed Jacob, who recognized professional law enforcement planning when he saw it. Sybil spent the early hours translating her journal entries into formal witness statements. Her ability to recall specific dates, times, and conversations amazed both Ruth and Jacob. Every detail strengthened their case against the fraud network. "The Martinez family lost their ranch on April 15th, Sybil read from her notes. "Tib used a forged deed and false witnesses. Sheriff Dalton signed off on the transfer without proper verification." Ruth copied the information into official Pinkerton reports while Jacob cross-referenced property records. The scope of corruption extended beyond simple fraud into systematic theft, targeting the most vulnerable families in the territory. The federal marshals established their temporary headquarters in Ruth's saloon. Lead Marshal Thomas Burke reviewed Sybil's documentation with growing amazement. Her evidence provided the missing connections his agency had been seeking for months. "This young lady has done more investigative work than most trained detectives," Burke told Jacob. "Her observations are precise and legally admissible." Sybil felt warmth spread through her chest at the recognition. Years of hiding her intelligence behind forced silence had finally ended. These men valued her mind and respected her contributions. Jacob worked alongside the marshals, his old skills returning naturally. Reading legal documents, organizing evidence, and planning arrests felt familiar despite 3 years away from the badge. Purpose filled the empty spaces grief had carved in his spirit. The investigation team visited the victimized families throughout the morning. Sybil's language skills proved invaluable when interviewing Spanish-speaking immigrants who had been too frightened to report their losses to local authorities. Maria Santos wept when Sybil explained in Spanish that help had finally arrived. Her family's small farm had been stolen through forged documents while her husband worked in distant mines. She had been left with nothing except 3 children and memories of better times. "Tell her we're going to get her land back," Marshal Burke said. Sybil translated, and Maria's tears transformed from despair to hope. Similar scenes played out at a dozen other homes as families learned their suffering had not been forgotten. By midday, the evidence against Tib and his associates had grown overwhelming. Property deeds, witness statements, and financial records painted a clear picture of systematic criminal enterprise. The network had stolen thousands of dollars worth of land and property. Sheriff Dalton arrived at the saloon demanding explanations for the federal presence. His blustering confidence evaporated when Ruth presented her Pinkerton credentials and Marshal Burke showed him arrest warrants. "You're interfering with local jurisdiction," Dalton blustered. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit mail fraud," Burke replied, signaling his deputies. Dalton's face went pale as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The corrupt lawman had expected his position to protect him from consequences. Federal authority trumped local politics. Word of the arrest spread quickly through town. Citizens who had suspected something wrong but lacked the courage to speak up began approaching the marshals with additional information. The dam of silence was finally breaking. Jacob felt his old sense of justice reawakening as he helped process the expanding case. Working alongside honest law enforcement reminded him why he had worn a badge in the first place. Protecting the innocent and punishing the guilty gave life meaning beyond personal survival. Sybil discovered that her documentation had captured evidence of crimes she hadn't even recognized at the time. Her detailed observations of Tibbs' meetings revealed connections to criminal networks operating across multiple territories. "You've helped us identify a much larger conspiracy," Marshall Burke explained. "This case could prevent similar crimes from happening to other families." The recognition filled Sybil with pride and purpose she had never experienced. Her survival instincts had accidentally served a greater cause. Justice was finally possible for families like her own. Ruth coordinated communications with Pinkerton headquarters while managing the logistics of housing federal marshals in a small frontier town. Her months of undercover work were paying dividends as the network of corruption crumbled under professional investigation. Late afternoon brought news that Tibb had barricaded himself in his house with 2 armed associates. The men refused to surrender and threatened violence against anyone who approached. The situation required careful handling to avoid bloodshed. Jacob volunteered to approach the house and attempt negotiation. His experience as a marshal had taught him that cornered criminals often responded to calm authority better than force. "Let me go with you," Sybil said. "He might listen if I'm there." "Too dangerous," Jacob replied. "He's going to run or fight either way," Sybil insisted. "But he might hesitate if he sees that his victims aren't afraid anymore." Marshall Burke considered the suggestion carefully. Unconventional approaches sometimes succeeded where standard procedures failed. "She stays behind cover," Burke decided, "but her voice might reach him when ours can't." They approached Tibbs' house with careful precision. Federal marshals surrounded the building while Jacob positioned himself within speaking distance of the front door. "Harold Tibb," Jacob called out. "You're surrounded by federal agents. Come out peacefully and nobody gets hurt." Silence stretched from the house. Then Tibbs' voice, strained and desperate. "I know you're out there, girl. This is all your fault." Sybil stepped forward, protected by Jacob's position but clearly visible. "No, Mr. Tibb," she called back. "This is all your fault, and it's finally over." The truth of those words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of 3 years of hidden documentation and careful justice. Everything that happened next would determine whether that justice could finally be served. Tibbs' house remained silent for long minutes after Sybil's declaration. The federal marshals maintained their positions while Jacob assessed the situation with professional calm. Years of experience had taught him that desperate men made unpredictable choices. Marshal Burke signaled his deputies to tighten the perimeter. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the property, providing cover for the law enforcement team. No escape routes remained open for the barricaded criminals. "Harold," Jacob called again, "there's nowhere to run. Make this easy on yourself." A window shutter cracked open on the second floor. The barrel of a rifle appeared briefly before disappearing back inside. Tibb was armed and positioned for a standoff. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Tibb shouted from inside. "This goes bigger than Cedar Falls, bigger than you can imagine." Ruth exchanged glances with Marshall Burke. Her months of investigation had suggested connections beyond the local network, but concrete proof had remained elusive. "Tell us about it," Jacob replied. "Come out and explain everything." "They'll kill me if I talk. Better to die here than face what's waiting." The fear in Tibbs' voice revealed something new. He wasn't just a local criminal operating independently. Someone else controlled the network, someone dangerous enough to terrify a man facing federal arrest. Sybil stepped closer to Jacob's position, her mind racing through everything she had documented over 3 years. Patterns emerged that she had never connected before. "The man in the expensive suit," she said quietly. "He visited every few months, always carried a leather satchel, always left with Tibb looking nervous." Jacob nodded. "Territory boss. Probably collecting percentages and giving orders." Marshall Burke approached their position with tactical awareness. The standoff was providing intelligence about a larger criminal organization. "We need Tibb alive," Burke said. "His testimony could break up operations across multiple territories." "He's more afraid of his bosses than of federal prison," Jacob observed. Ruth had been thinking the same thing. Her Pinkerton training included techniques for handling terrified criminals who faced threats from multiple directions. "What if we offer protection?" she suggested. "Witness relocation in exchange for cooperation." The idea had merit. Federal authorities could provide security that local criminals couldn't match. But first they needed to convince Tib that survival was possible. Jacob made the decision to try a different approach. Instead of demanding surrender, he would offer hope. "Harold, listen carefully," he called out. "We know you're not the head of this operation. We know someone else is giving orders. Help us catch the real criminals and we can protect you." Silence stretched from the house. The offer was processing in Tib's mind alongside his fear of retribution. "You can't protect me from them," Tib finally replied. "They have people everywhere, even in federal agencies." The admission confirmed Ruth's suspicions about corruption extending beyond local authorities. Her investigation had uncovered evidence of criminal influence reaching into territorial government. "Maybe," Jacob acknowledged, "but you're definitely dead if you stay in that house. At least cooperation gives you a chance." Movement appeared at multiple windows as Tib's associates grew restless. The standoff was stretching their nerves toward breaking points. Sybil studied the house with new understanding. Her documented observations had captured more than local fraud. She had been recording the operations of a territorial criminal syndicate. "The railroad survey," she said suddenly. "That's why they wanted specific properties. The new railroad line is coming through those exact locations." Jacob and Ruth stared at her as the implications became clear. The land fraud wasn't random theft. It was strategic acquisition of valuable railroad right-of-way properties. "How much money are we talking about?" Burke asked. "Hundreds of thousands of dollars," Ruth replied. "Maybe millions when the railroad pays for access rights." The scope of the conspiracy dwarfed anything they had imagined. Local families had been systematically destroyed to enable massive corporate theft. "Harold," Jacob called out with new urgency. "We know about the railroad money. We know this was bigger than local fraud. Come out now and help us stop them." A gunshot cracked from inside the house, then another. The marshals tensed and prepared for combat, but no bullets came their direction. "Sounds like they're fighting each other," Burke observed. The front door burst open and one of Tib's associates stumbled out with his hands raised. Blood streamed from a head wound as he collapsed on the porch. "Don't shoot!" the man gasped. "Tibbs lost his mind. He's going to burn everything." Smoke began curling from the house's upper windows. Tib had decided to destroy evidence rather than face capture or retribution. "Get the fire brigade!" Burke shouted to his deputies. Jacob made a split-second decision. Critical evidence was burning inside that house. Evidence that could expose a criminal network stretching across territories. "Sybil, stay back," he ordered, then sprinted toward the burning building. Marshal Burke and two deputies followed Jacob's lead. They had minutes before the fire spread beyond control. Ruth grabbed Sybil's arm as she started to follow. "Let them handle it. Your documentation is safe. That's what matters most." The house fire illuminated the late afternoon sky as Cedar Falls Volunteer Fire Brigade raced toward the scene. Tibbs' voice could be heard inside, shouting incoherently as flames consumed his criminal empire. Jacob emerged from the smoke carrying a metal strongbox and armloads of documents. Marshal Burke followed with more papers and account books. Critical evidence had been saved from destruction. The wounded associate was providing information to federal agents, desperate to save himself from prosecution. His testimony was filling gaps in their understanding of the territorial conspiracy. As Tibbs' house burned to the ground, Sybil realized her 3 years of careful documentation had helped expose something far greater than local corruption. Justice was finally within reach for dozens of families across multiple territories. Harold Tibb never emerged from his burning house. The fire consumed both the man and his secrets, leaving only charred timbers and the justice he had tried to destroy. The wounded associate's confession filled the gaps that flames couldn't erase. Marshal Burke spread the rescued documents across tables in Ruth's saloon. Account books revealed payments to corrupt officials across 3 territories. The railroad conspiracy reached deeper than anyone had imagined. Tibb was collecting properties for Eastern investors, Burke explained to the gathered townspeople. They planned to sell railroad access rights for 10 times what they paid the original owners. The crowd murmured with growing anger. Families had been destroyed for corporate profit. Children had gone hungry so distant businessmen could grow richer. Sybil stood before the assembled citizens with her journal open. The girl who had been sold for $5 now commanded the attention of an entire community. The Martinez family lost 40 acres on Rocky Creek, she read clearly. The Santos family lost their farmhouse and barn. The Williams family lost everything because they couldn't read the false documents. Each name carried weight. Each loss represented lives shattered by systematic cruelty. Her documentation gave voice to the voiceless. Jacob watched Sybil address the crowd with quiet pride. The trembling girl from the auction block had transformed into a powerful advocate for justice. Her intelligence and courage were reshaping an entire community. Ruth coordinated with federal agents to process the expanding evidence. Her months of undercover work had culminated in the largest fraud prosecution in territorial history. Dozens of arrests would follow in the coming weeks. Property deeds will be returned to rightful owners, Marshal Burke announced. The federal government guarantees restitution for all documented losses. Cheers erupted from families who had thought their land was lost forever. Maria Santos wept with joy as she learned her children would inherit their father's farm after all. The rescued account books revealed payments to corrupt officials in the territorial capital. The conspiracy reached into the governor's office and the Railroad Commission. Federal investigators would spend months unraveling the network. Sheriff Dalton sat in chains, his badge stripped and his corruption exposed. The community would elect honest law enforcement with federal oversight. Cedar Falls would never again suffer under corrupt local authority. Jacob found himself drawn back into law enforcement, despite his earlier reluctance. Marshal Burke offered him a federal commission to help clean up territorial corruption. Purpose filled the void that grief had carved in his spirit. "I'll take the badge," Jacob told Burke, "but I want to stay based here. This community deserves protection." Sybil's role in exposing the conspiracy earned her recognition throughout the territory. Federal prosecutors requested her assistance with similar cases in other regions. Her investigative skills had proven invaluable to professional law enforcement. "You could work for the Pinkerton Agency," Ruth suggested. "They need intelligent people who understand how criminals think." The offer tempted Sybil, but her heart remained tied to Cedar Falls and the families she had helped save. Justice meant more than career advancement. 3 months after the fire, the town gathered for a celebration. Families had reclaimed their properties. Honest officials had been elected. The railroad company had agreed to pay fair prices for legitimate access rights. Jacob pinned his new federal marshal's badge to his vest with steady hands. The ceremony felt like redemption for past failures. He could protect people again without the crushing weight of previous loss. Sybil received a formal commendation from the territorial governor for her service to justice. The document recognized her intelligence, courage, and dedication to protecting the innocent. The auction block where she had once stood in chains was removed from the town square. In its place, the community erected a monument to justice and the courage of ordinary people who fight extraordinary corruption. Jacob's ranch prospered under their joint management. Sybil's organizational skills and his law enforcement salary provided stability neither had known in years. The property became a refuge for other families recovering from fraud losses. Their relationship had evolved naturally from partnership to love. Neither could pinpoint the exact moment friendship became something deeper. Trust and shared purpose had grown into lasting affection. "We should expand the school," Sybil suggested one evening as they watched sunset paint the mountains. "More families are settling here now that the corruption is gone." Jacob nodded. "Good idea. The territorial government owes this community educational opportunities." Their conversations always returned to ways they could help others. Individual healing had led to community service. Personal justice had become a foundation for broader change. Ruth's Saloon became an informal community center where traveling federal agents shared information about ongoing investigations. Her undercover work had ended, but her commitment to fighting corruption continued. The Territorial Railroad brought prosperity to Cedar Falls without the exploitation Tib had planned. Fair compensation for land access funded new businesses and improved infrastructure. Honest growth replaced criminal schemes. Jacob and Sybil married in the spring, surrounded by families they had helped save. The ceremony celebrated not just their union, but the community's transformation from fear to hope. Their wedding announcement described them as partners in justice and love. The girl sold for $5 had become a respected advocate. The grieving former marshal had found purpose in protection and partnership. Children now played safely in streets once controlled by corrupt officials. Families worked land they owned legitimately. The community thrived under honest government and federal protection. Sybil kept writing, documenting the town's recovery and growth. Her records would help future historians understand how ordinary courage could defeat systematic corruption. Jacob wore his badge with pride, earned through redemption. Every family he protected honored the memory of those he couldn't save years earlier. Their story became legend throughout the territory. The auction block transaction that seemed like an ending had become the beginning of justice, love, and lasting change for an entire community.